This may look like a sleepy little seaside town somewhere in the British Isles. In fact, the United Kingdom is 8,000 miles away. These are the Falkland Islands, a remote British territory in the South Atlantic. The nearest mainland is Argentina, just 400 miles to the west. But in 1981, a new military government seized power in Argentina. At its head was the army commander, General Leopoldo Galtieri. His regime was a rule of terror, and the country's economy was collapsing. He badly needed to find a cause that would win his government's popularity. There was one issue Galtieri knew his people cared passionately about: their claim to the Falkland Islands. And on April the 2nd, 1982, Galtieri's repossession of the Falklands was going exactly to plan.
Within hours of landing, hundreds of Argentinian troops were all over Stanley. They had even seized the radio station.
Just a minute. If you take the gun out of my back, I'm going to transmit that to you. If you take the gun away.
The governor, Rex Hunt, had little choice but to surrender. He broadcast a final message to the islanders from Government House.
It's probably the last message I'll be able to give you. I wish you all the best of luck, and rest assured that the British will be back.
The governor and the Royal Marines were escorted off the islands and sent back to Britain. The civilians were left wondering what would happen next. 8,000 miles from Britain, the islanders were left unprotected and isolated.
When the news of the British surrender hit Buenos Aires that afternoon, 200,000 Argentinians poured into the main square, wildly applauding the liberation of the Islas Malvinas. Galtieri's plan had worked. In 1982, Britain's first female Prime Minister was governing a country in trouble. Britain was in recession. Unemployment had just passed the 3 million mark, and there'd been some of the worst rioting of the 20th century. But Thatcher was a formidable character. She knew that to hesitate could spell doom for her unpopular government. She summoned Parliament and gave a defiant response to Argentina's invasion.
We are here because for the first time for many years, British sovereign territory has been invaded by a foreign power. The government has now decided that a large task force will sail as soon as all preparations are complete. HMS Invincible will be in the lead and will leave port on Monday.
And so, in the spring of 1982, a British task force set sail. Ahead lay an 8,000-mile journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the Falkland Islands. In all, 93 ships would sail to the Falklands, a hastily gathered fleet of warships, supply ships, and even cruise liners like the QE2. At the heart of the fleet were two aircraft carriers, HMS Invincible and HMS Hermes. Hermes was the flagship and home to the task force commander, Rear Admiral Sandy Woodward. Woodward's fleet would take 3 weeks to reach the Falklands. During that time, Britain would try for a diplomatic solution. But if that failed, the task force would have to go to war when it got there. As the fleet sailed south, United Nations and US diplomats tried for a peaceful settlement. But by April the 30th, any hope of a diplomatic solution evaporated. Neither side would back down. The man in charge was Brigadier General Mario Menendez. Menendez was a tough soldier, who'd made his name fighting rebels in remote parts of Argentina. He was quickly sworn in as the new governor of the Falklands. His first task was to prepare his defenses.
On the 1st of May 1982, the battle for the Falklands began. The first clash between Britain and Argentina was in the air. But despite being the underdog, the British immediately showed they were a force to be reckoned with.
The British had scored a huge military success, and Galtieri's plan seemed to be faltering. But he was still able to unleash the weapon the British feared most. The Argentinians had recently bought 5 air-launched exocets. These half-ton missiles could seek out and destroy a ship from over 30 miles away. On the morning of the 4th of May, 2 Argentinian strike aircraft, each armed with an exocet, took off from the mainland. HMS Sheffield was the first British ship to be destroyed by enemy action since the Second World War. Of the 281 men aboard, 20 were killed and 26 were wounded. By mid-May, the South Atlantic winter was closing in. Some Harriers had been lost in combat, and now the bad weather was beginning to hinder the pilots. The success of the British plan relied on having complete control of the air to provide cover for landing the ground troops. But the British didn't have that cover, and now time was running out. On the 18th of May, the second wave of ships, including ferries and the cruise liner the Canberra, arrived just off the Falklands. On board was the amphibious landing force. The Argentinian High Command sent in wave after wave of their fighter bombers from the mainland. For 5 hours, these aircraft bombed and strafed the fleet sitting in the bay. The surrounding hills made it almost impossible for the ship's radars to detect the enemy aircraft, so the British were unable to get a fix on the attacking planes until it was too late. On the 25th of May, it was Argentina's National Day, a day of patriotic ceremony. And after the successes of their air campaign, Menendez and his troops in the Falklands had even more reason to celebrate.
Subordinación y valor.
But it wasn't over yet. The Argentinian Air Force was preparing another raid that would hit the British land campaign where it really hurt. A massive container ship, the Atlantic Conveyor, had just arrived from Britain. She was loaded with thousands of tons of supplies, but more importantly, the helicopters needed by the British forces to get them to Stanley. She was preparing to go into San Carlos that night. Fire ripped through the ship, and all 9 helicopters still on board were destroyed. They were led by Brigadier Julian Thompson. Thompson was an experienced commander. He knew that his troops were vulnerable without air superiority, but the pressure of time meant the landings had to go ahead.
The next day, the Paras were astonished to see over 900 Argentinians, nearly twice their own number and nearly 3 times more than they had expected, lay down their weapons. After 6 weeks under Argentinian occupation, Goose Green was back in British hands, and the soldiers of Para were heroes. But the battle for this tiny place had come at a huge cost. More than 70 soldiers were dead, 16 British and over 50 Argentinians.
Lance Corporal Smith. Lance Corporal Bingley.
What had begun as a quick raid to seize back the airstrip and liberate the community had turned into a bloody battle in the struggle for the Falkland Islands.
While Para had been fighting at Goose Green, the main British force had crossed the island and was now just 12 miles from the capital. But the soldiers knew they faced a tough fight between them and Stanley.
We've got to take Stanley. No stopping us now, I don't reckon.
Got to get it done fast, so the only way to do it is get in there.
Do you have any feelings of apprehension, though?
Oh yes, definitely. Without a shadow of a doubt.
Everything seemed to be going to plan. But then the British campaign suffered a massive blow.
They caught both ships in broad daylight, packed with troops and ammunition. "49 men were killed and a further 115 injured in the disaster.
Nine days after the landings at San Carlos, a senior commander, Major General Jeremy Moore, took overall control of the British land campaign. Undeterred by the Argentinian air attacks, Moore moved around 9,000 troops into position near the hills surrounding Stanley.
As day broke, the British brought in the dead and injured from both sides. Most of the Argentinian casualties and prisoners were conscript soldiers, young men drafted into the army. While these soldiers had fought well, many of them were worn down by the conditions before the battle had begun.
Though this had been a bloody battle for both sides, the British attacks had taken all the high ground they'd planned to on the first night. But another night's fighting still lay ahead.
As dawn broke, the battle was still raging on Tumbledown, and the British forces prepared to throw everything they had into the fight for Stanley. They hammered the remaining enemy positions in a final all-out bombardment. Soon, Argentinian troops could be seen fleeing. The Argentinian resistance was crumbling. As the demoralized defenders poured into Stanley, the men were heard arguing with their superiors. Discipline among the Argentinian troops was breaking down. It wasn't long before they were surrounded.
And on the 14th of June, the British demanded the Argentinians surrender.
Gentlemen, I've just heard that the white flag is flying over Stanley.
The Argentinians had occupied Stanley for 74 days. But now, as Para marched into the capital, it was back in British hands.
A month later, the first British troops arrived back home to jubilant celebrations. This victory had given people a renewed sense of pride in their country and a feeling that Britain could lift itself out of its recent decline.
And riding on the crest of this success was Margaret Thatcher. Within a year, she won the general election with a resounding majority. The Iron Lady had cemented her position as a major world leader.
In Argentina, the news of the surrender was taken very badly. Far from uniting the people, the war had left the Argentinians furious at the army and the government.
Just 3 days after Argentina's defeat, Galtieri was forced from power and military rule collapsed in Argentina.
Over in the Falklands, the legacy of this bitter conflict lives on. Nearly 1,000 people died in the war, 252 British servicemen, 3 Falkland Islanders, and almost 700 Argentinians.
After the war ended, Britain greatly increased its permanent military presence on the islands. Now there's 1 serviceman for every 2 civilians living here. Today, the islanders are still determined the Falklands remain British. As long as Britain continues to respect their wishes, there'll be no early end to this bitter territorial dispute.